He had always wondered what people meant when they said the past had a way of calling you back. But he never imagined that call would arrive as a brittle envelope wedged beneath a chipped coffee mug at the shelter. An envelope that held nothing more than a rough hand-drawn map and his grandmother's shaky signature, like a voice carried forward in ink. It came on a washed-out autumn morning when the air felt paper-thin and unfriendly, when the world spoke in cold whispers instead of kind words. The weight of homelessness pressed so hard against his chest that even breathing felt like something he had to bargain for every hour. For months he had pretended the world wasn't caving in around him, forcing a tired smile while the ground slipped away. Months telling his young son Ethan that things would work out somehow, that this was temporary, that better days were just late, not gone. Months praying in half-broken sentences, unsure if God still watched them from anywhere at all, or if their faces had faded from even heaven's memory. So when he unfolded the strange map, edges frayed, ink faded into faint veins of blue and black, it felt almost unreal. Lines of mountain ridges, a single unnamed trail, and something circled 3 times, as if insisting on being found. No explanation, no message, no story, just a silent command in paper form that seemed to say, "Come find me." At first, his instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away, to tell himself it was pointless, some old fragment of fantasy from a woman who had been gone for years. His grandmother's cabin in the mountains belonged to another life, a distant childhood where loneliness had seemed exotic instead of crushing. Nothing good, he told himself, waited in those heights where she had chosen to live alone and quiet, tucked far from the noise of everything. But then he looked at Ethan, curled against his side on the shelter cot, clutching the one small toy that had somehow survived every eviction and hurried escape. The boy's face was thinner now, sleep restless around the edges, hope fraying but still stubbornly there. Something inside the father cracked, a tiny shift like ice breaking on a river, part realization, part surrender, and part desperate refusal to stay where they were. Maybe it didn't matter if the map led nowhere. Maybe the simple act of following it would force their lives to move, even if just a little. He folded the map carefully, as if it were fragile skin, slid it into his jacket, and told Ethan they were going on a little adventure. Ethan's eyes were tired, but his smile came anyway, small and delicate yet bright enough to remind his father that even broken things could still catch the light. That evening they slipped out of the shelter and moved through the edge of town, autumn wind pushing leaves along the pavement like hurried messengers. The sun sank behind leaning buildings, turning everything into a muted painting of rust, gold, and exhausted green. Their footsteps were soft on the cracked sidewalk, their breaths puffing into the chill air in brief ghosts that vanished as quickly as they formed. He kept one hand resting on Ethan's shoulder and the other pressed against the map in his pocket, as though the thin paper could keep the noise of doubt from getting too loud. The road out of town felt longer than any memory, stretched and warped compared to the blurred images from his childhood. Back then, the distance had been softened by nostalgia and the illusion that grown-ups were in control of the world. Now each step carried a strange electricity, a faint sense that something beneath the surface of ordinary life was shifting, rearranging itself around them. They passed fences leaning into the wind like tired sentries, fields lying dry and mottled with the smell of distant rain they could not see. An abandoned gas station flickered with the last pulse of a dying bulb, humming weakly against the evening. Ethan finally asked where they were going, his voice thin but curious. "I'm not sure," the father answered honestly, "but your great-grandma wanted us to see something." Ethan nodded as if that answer made perfect sense, as if they had stepped into a story whose ending he trusted without needing to know. Maybe that faith was the only thing that kept their feet moving when the sky turned steel grey and the wind curled cold fingers around their jackets. By the time they reached the first rise of the foothills, daylight had dissolved into full night, and the moon hung muted behind slow-moving clouds. He found a small patch of shelter beneath a cluster of pine trees, and pulled out the old camping gear he hadn't used in years, pieces of another life he'd thought he'd left behind for good. The air bit at their cheeks as he set up a worn tent and spread out thin blankets, their breath pooling in the narrow space like wandering mist. Ethan fell asleep quickly, worn out by miles of walking and weeks of worry, his head resting on his father's leg as though it had always belonged there. In the hush that followed, the father pulled out the map again, letting the dim flame of his small lantern wash its surface in trembling light. Up close, it made even less sense. It didn't resemble anything drawn by a proper surveyor or cartographer. No precise measurements or neat labels. It felt too intimate, too deliberate, like a private whisper disguised as ink and paper. He traced the faint lines with one finger, following the ridges and the solitary trail that wound toward the triple-circled mark. Why would she leave this for him? Why now, when his life had been stripped down to raw survival, when he felt more hollow than human? He whispered a quiet prayer, simple and unpolished, thanking God not for answers, but for at least a direction. Not a solution, not yet, but a way to walk that wasn't just away from pain. When dawn arrived, it seeped gently through the trees, turning needles and bark into slow gradients of copper, amber, and pale honey. The mountains rose ahead of them like ancient sentinels, steady and watchful, their silhouettes etched against the awakening sky. He nudged Ethan awake with a soft hand on his shoulder, and together they stepped back onto the faint path, letting the map guide their feet deeper into the woods. The trail was hardly a trail at all, more of a suggestion, scratched into the land, yet the bends and curves matched the markings almost perfectly. As they walked, the forest shifted around them from familiar to strangely enchanted. Branches arched overhead, weaving themselves into natural tunnels of burnt orange and gold, leaves drifting down to brush their jackets like gentle, passing hands. Every sound seemed amplified, the crisp crunch of fallen foliage, the sigh of the wind slipping between trunks, the occasional distant call of an unseen bird. It was eerie and beautiful at the same time, as if the forest carried old secrets that it refused to say out loud, but couldn't completely hide. Somewhere within that quiet, he felt an unfamiliar warmth begin to glow inside his chest. Not the loud blaze of certainty, but a small ember, a muted hope that didn't demand attention, only room to breathe. Ethan asked questions as they picked their way between roots and stones, his voice soft but steady. Who made the map? What they might find, whether his great-grandma had been kind or strict or strange. The father answered as best he could, pulling fragments of memory from the corners of his mind. Stories of a woman who was both gentle and fierce, who lived alone but never seemed lonely, who insisted the world still held hidden wonders even when life had tried to convince her otherwise. The more he spoke, the more real she became, her presence gathering around them like the echo of a long-forgotten lullaby. At midday, they reached a clearing he didn't recognize. A wide patch of light cutting through the trees where the air felt different, thinner and sharper. The map led them straight across it, past a fallen log draped in bright green moss toward a ridge where the ground suddenly dipped away into a narrow cut in the mountain. He tightened his hold on Ethan's hand as they descended, boots sliding slightly on loose soil until the trees parted and a slender valley unfolded before them, carved neatly into the stone. There, half hidden between rock and shadow as if trying not to be noticed, stood an old wooden post leaning at an angle, a strip of red cloth tied stubbornly around it. The same cloth appeared on the map as a tiny faded mark, drawn with a small X beside it, as though his grandmother had been reaching through time to point directly to this spot. His breath caught in his chest. This was real, not some imagined relic of grief. She had meant for him to find it. He stepped closer and ran his fingers over the worn wood, tracing grooves carved by weather, years, and intention. The post felt warm from the afternoon sun despite the chill wrapping the valley. Ethan tugged at his sleeve, small face turned toward a darker sliver between two large boulders. "Dad, look." The father followed his gaze and saw what he had first taken for a shadow. A narrow split in the rock, a dark seam that could easily be dismissed unless someone knew exactly where to look. The final curves on the map pointed straight to it. A shiver moved through him, not of fear, but of recognition, the quiet certainty that this was where they were meant to go. Yet he hesitated for a moment, listening to the wind slide past the stones, carrying the deep, cold smell of earth that had been undisturbed for a very long time. He could almost imagine his grandmother's voice woven into that breeze, urging him to step forward. He crouched beside Ethan, resting a steady hand on the boy's shoulder as the dark seam in the rock gaped before them like a held breath. "Whatever is in there, we go together," he said quietly, voice low but firm, and Ethan nodded, fingers tightening around his father's jacket. The entrance was narrower than it first appeared, more like a crack than a doorway, and they had to turn sideways, scraping shoulders against cool stone as they squeezed through. For a moment, they were swallowed by darkness, the air damp and close. But then, the narrow passage opened into a corridor tall enough for them to stand straight. Their footsteps echoed softly, blending with the faint drip of water somewhere further in, a steady rhythm that felt almost like the heartbeat of the mountain. Thin shafts of light slid through cracks high above, scattering dust into shimmering patterns that floated and turned like tiny wandering spirits. The space felt old, not neglected, but preserved. Like stepping into a memory the earth itself had chosen to keep. He moved slowly, guiding Ethan ahead of him at times and beside him at others, every sense stretched tight between fear and awe. His skin prickled with the overwhelming sensation that they were crossing an invisible threshold into something meant specifically for them. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became, clinging to their lungs and seeping through their clothes. The walls glistened with beads of moisture, reflecting the faint light in dull, silver streaks. Fine roots dangled from the ceiling like fragile threads, brushing the tops of their heads whenever the tunnel dipped low. Yet despite the eerie quiet, the father did not feel hunted or unwelcome. If anything, he felt as though the mountain had been waiting, patient and unhurried, for the day someone carrying this particular map would return. Time slipped strangely in the passage, each step stretching longer than the last until he lost track of how far they had gone. Then, at last, the tunnel widened and opened into a natural chamber, its roof rising high above them. A single beam of sunlight pierced a crack in the ceiling, falling in a perfect column to the ground and bathing one spot in warm light. In the center of that circle of brightness stood a small wooden chest, old yet intact, its edges smoothed by hands long gone. His breath snagged, and beside him, Ethan gave a tiny gasp, eyes round and reflecting the golden glow. The chest was not locked. No rusted metal, no heavy chains, just a simple latch that seemed to invite rather than guard. His knees felt weak as he stepped forward, each pace heavier than the last, as though weighted with every year of loss behind him. He knelt in front of the chest, fingers trembling as he reached for the latch. For a heartbeat he hesitated, listening to the silence, to the sound of Ethan's breathing behind him, to the slow drip of water echoing off stone. Then he lifted the lid. Inside lay carefully arranged objects, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of cedar and age. On top of everything else rested a small framed photograph. He picked it up gently, and his vision blurred. His grandmother held him as a baby, her face soft with pride, eyes crinkled at the corners. Beside her stood a man he did not recognize, but the tenderness in the way the man leaned toward them tightened something deep in his chest. Beneath the photograph lay an envelope bearing his name in her familiar, uneven handwriting, fragile yet determined. His hands shook harder as he opened it, unfolding the pages with almost reverent care. Her words spilled out like a voice carried into the hollow chamber, telling him she had always feared the world might shatter him, the way it had fractured the lives before his. She wrote that even if life stripped him bare, she wanted him to remember he came from strength, from stubborn love, from a family that refused to let darkness have the final say. She confessed to regrets, to secrets left unspoken for too long, to a heritage buried beneath the mountain through generations of whispered instructions and hand-drawn maps. She wrote that everything he needed to rebuild his life, to stand again with his head unbowed, rested inside this chest. His throat closed as he set the letter aside and looked deeper into the box. There were documents, deeds with old signatures, brittle pages bearing official seals he did not yet understand, bank information, account numbers and forms carefully bundled together, several keys of different sizes and shapes, more than he could immediately make sense of, clinking softly when he moved them. At the bottom rested a small metal container, heavier than it appeared, edges cold against his fingers when he lifted it out. His heart hammered so hard it almost hurt as he unlatched the lid and pushed it open. For a moment, his mind refused to recognize what he was seeing. Neatly packed bars, small but dense, stacked in precise rows. Gold, real gold, more than he had ever seen, more than he had ever even allowed himself to imagine. His breath left him in a broken whisper he could barely form. Ethan leaned closer, eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. "Dad, what is it?" he asked, voice unsure but hopeful. The father swallowed, tears spilling silently down his face before he could stop them, his chest aching with the weight of disbelief and relief crashing together. "It's a miracle," he managed, the words soft and hoarse, but even as he spoke, he knew the metal was only part of what had just changed. Beneath the shock, something deeper surged through him. Connection, forgiveness, a thread of identity he had thought snapped forever now, suddenly, painfully restored. His grandmother hadn't just left him a treasure. She had left him a way back to himself, a bridge from the man who had been sleeping on shelter floors to the one she believed he could still become. Ethan wrapped his small arms around his father's waist, grounding him in the present, anchoring him when his thoughts threatened to float away under the sheer enormity of it all. The father rested a hand on his son's back and closed his eyes, letting gratitude rise until it felt almost like light, pressing against his ribs from the inside out. He whispered another prayer, not desperate this time, but overflowing, a thank you that seemed too small for what had been given. For a long while he simply knelt in that half-lit chamber, the chest open before him, unable to fully grasp how a life that had crumbled so brutally could shift so completely in a single moment. The gold, the deeds, the letters, each item in the box felt almost unreal, like props in someone else's story that had been accidentally handed to him. Ethan stayed close, fingers gripping his jacket, eyes flicking between his father's tear-streaked face and the gleaming bars. The boy didn't understand the numbers or the systems behind those documents, but he understood that something enormous had just happened. Children always seemed to sense when the ground beneath their world rearranged itself, even if they couldn't name the fault lines. Eventually the father closed the chest gently, his palms lingering on the worn wood, as though trying to absorb whatever strength his grandmother had pressed into it years ago. He whispered a thank you to her, to God, to every unseen mercy that had steered them through alleys and hunger and cold nights to this hidden place. But as the rush of awe began to soften, a quieter awareness drifted in behind it. Treasure was one thing. Survival, understanding, purpose, those were something else entirely. He tried to lift the chest, testing its weight, and his arms strained immediately, muscles burning from the effort. Carrying it through the narrow tunnel with Ethan by his side would be nearly impossible. Reluctantly, he set it back down and began to search through the contents again, this time looking for anything small and useful that he could take with them for now. He found a leather pouch filled with several heavy coins, their edges worn but still sharp with worth. Tucked beneath them lay a folded document that appeared to be some form of withdrawal authorization, stamped and signed in ways that suggested access to something greater. It would not transform their lives overnight, but it was enough to begin, to move them from desperation to possibility. Ethan tugged gently at his sleeve. "Dad, are we rich now?" he asked, the words fragile and trembling between hope and fear. The father knelt again so he could meet his son's eyes directly, those young eyes that had seen far too much for their age. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, voice steady but soft. "But I do know this. We're not lost anymore, and we're not alone. That's what matters right now." Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that answer as if it were solid ground. As the father prepared to leave the chamber, something at the far edge of the cavern caught his attention, a shape half swallowed by shadow. A stone pillar jutted from the floor, its surface carved with intricate patterns he didn't recognize, swirling lines like streams or wind, interwoven with small figures that looked almost human. One shape reminded him of his grandmother's outline, though he couldn't tell if that was memory rising or his imagination trying to give her a place on the stone. What truly held his focus, though, was the faint glow seeping from beneath the base of the pillar. A soft, warm shimmer, subtle but unmistakable, as though the rock itself breathed light. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer and placed his hand against the cool surface. A barely perceptible vibration pulsed beneath his fingers, like a patient heartbeat hidden deep within the mountain. He didn't know whether to feel reassured or unsettled. Before he could decide, Ethan's small voice echoed through the chamber. "Dad, I'm a little scared." The father instantly drew back from the pillar, the mystery of stone and glow pushed aside by the greater urgency of his son's fear. He knelt beside Ethan once more, brushing a hand gently through the boy's hair. "I know, buddy," he said quietly. "I'm scared too. But being scared doesn't always mean we're in danger. Sometimes it just means something big is happening." Ethan nodded, though his eyes stayed wide, uncertainty still lingering in their depths. The father realized they had gone far enough underground for one day. Whatever secrets the pillar held, whatever the faint glow meant, could wait. They needed daylight, they needed open air, and above all, they needed a place that felt safe. He looked back at the chest, at the letter, at the photograph, and made a silent promise to return. For now, he pulled the old tarp-like fragment he'd found in a corner of the chamber and carefully draped it over the chest, shielding it as best he could from moisture and dust. Then he took the pouch of coins and the key documents, folding them securely into an inner pocket. When he pulled the map out again, something on its surface caught his eye, markings he had overlooked in his earlier shock. Faint branching lines extended from the symbol of the tunnel toward a small cabin icon near the forest's edge. A place he dimly remembered from childhood, small and quiet, tucked away from everything. Maybe his grandmother had intended for him to find the chest first and the cabin second, each piece of the puzzle unlocking the next. Maybe the cabin held tools, shelter, explanations, something he would need before he could fully understand what lay hidden under stone and light. Either way, the message was clear. Their journey was not meant to end in that chamber. He took one last look at the glowing pillar in the distance, feeling both drawn and wary, then turned back toward the passage that had brought them in. He guided Ethan carefully through the tunnel, retracing their steps past dripping walls and hanging roots. The darkness felt less oppressive now, as though the mountain had accepted their presence. When they finally squeezed through the narrow opening and stepped back into the open valley, the world felt almost startlingly bright. The wind rushed over them with a sharp autumn bite, making Ethan shiver and laugh at the same time. Leaves skittered across the ground in restless spirals, as if urging them forward. He studied the map again, tracing the thin line that led northeast along a ridge marked by pines and birch. The distance to the cabin looked manageable, though he knew mountains often lied about how far they truly stretched. Still, they had direction, they had a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the quiet certainty that they were walking toward a future instead of away from a past. They followed the ridge northeast, the forest slowly changing around them as the air grew sharper and the birch trees rose like pale guardians along the slope. Ethan grew tired, so the father lifted him for part of the climb, grateful that years of physical labor had kept his strength intact despite everything life had taken from them. They crossed a small stream, swollen from recent rain, icy and loud, and for a moment Ethan dipped his fingers in and laughed at the shock of cold, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the first one the father had heard from him in weeks. The sound struck him like a prayer answered, soft yet powerful enough to make his throat tighten with emotion. They climbed higher until the ridge opened to a wide view of the valley, autumn light sliding across the land in slow golden sheets. And there, partially concealed behind brush and age, stood the cabin his grandmother once lived in. Weather-worn wood, a sagging roof, stone chimney stained from decades of smoke, all of it humble but undeniably real. Ethan's breath caught as he whispered, "Did she really live here?" The father nodded slowly, memories stirring like dust rising in sunlight, and they approached the steps, which creaked but held under their weight. He pushed the door gently, expecting resistance, but it swung open with a groan that echoed like a sigh from the past. Dust clung to every corner, old curtains drooped like forgotten ghosts, and a wooden table leaned slightly, one leg worn shorter than the others. Shelves lined the walls, still holding glass jars filled with herbs and dried leaves, their colors faded but their shapes intact. 2 chairs sat beside the ashes of an old fireplace, and a small bed occupied the corner, quilts folded neatly despite a film of age on the fabric. The cabin felt abandoned, yet not empty. It felt held, preserved, as if someone had stepped out only moments ago instead of years. Ethan wandered carefully, dragging a finger through dust, whispering, "It feels like she's still here." The father felt that too, an unspoken warmth lingering in the air like the echo of a presence that hadn't completely faded. He moved deeper inside, scanning the shadows, until something on the far wall caught his eye. A tapestry hung there, far too bright and untouched to belong in such an old space. Its colors, deep crimson, shimmering gold, and midnight blue, looked untouched by time, as if they had been painted only days ago. The tapestry depicted mountains, rivers, and a sky full of stars arranged in precise patterns that tugged faintly at his memory. At the very center sat a symbol he recognized instantly, the same one carved into the stone pillar in the underground chamber. His heart skipped, a quiet thud of recognition tumbling into curiosity. He reached out and brushed the tapestry gently, expecting dust, but the fabric felt strangely warm, almost alive beneath his fingertips. As he touched it, the cloth shifted slightly, revealing a small metal hook hidden behind its corner, a concealed latch. His pulse quickened as he slipped his fingers behind the fabric and lifted it, exposing a wooden panel embedded in the wall. It had no visible handle, but when he pressed his palm against its surface, a soft click sounded beneath his touch, followed by the slow swing of a hidden door opening inward. Behind it sat a shallow shelf holding a small wooden box bound with twine and marked with the same carved symbol. He carried the box to the crooked table and sat beside Ethan, who watched with wide, wondering eyes as he loosened the twine. Inside the box lay several folded pages written in his grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, along with an old compass, a metal key, and a pendant shaped like the recurring symbol they had found throughout the tunnels. He unfolded the first page carefully. It wasn't a letter, but a journal entry written in shaky lines, each word weighed with emotion. She wrote about discovering the tunnels in her youth, about secrets passed through generations, about treasures meant not for greed, but for rebuilding what life had broken in their family. She wrote of his mother, her regrets, her mistakes, the love she struggled to express, and the promise she made to protect her grandson even after she was gone. The words trembled with guilt and hope, with fear and faith woven together like threads in a tapestry. She confessed that she had prayed he would someday find the path she left behind, but only when he needed it most, only when he was ready to reclaim the parts of himself he didn't know he had lost. Her final line struck him hardest. If he arrives with a child, let love guide him deeper than fear ever could. His breath faltered as he pressed the pages to his chest, overwhelmed and unsteady. The weight of her love settling into places he had forgotten was still capable of warmth. Ethan leaned closer, whispering softly, "She knew we'd come." The father nodded, unable to speak, the truth sinking into him like roots gripping soil. After a long moment, he opened the remaining pages. They contained a hand-drawn map of a larger chamber hidden deeper within the mountain, a second sanctuary accessible only through a concealed route marked on the back of the original map. The first tunnel hadn't been the destination. It had been the doorway. The compass aligned with new markings. The key matched a sketch drawn beside a narrow passage. And the pendant, its shape identical to the carved symbols, seemed meant for something important, something still waiting. His grandmother hadn't just left treasure. She had left a path, a purpose, a final journey he was meant to finish. As the wind rattled the dusty windows and the cabin creaked softly with age, he felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not confusion, something steadier, heavier, like the settling of truth. He realized that the day in the tunnel had only been the beginning. There were deeper secrets hidden beneath the mountain, pieces of his family's story buried under stone and silence, waiting for the right hands to uncover them. His grandmother had entrusted this responsibility to him, not because he was strong, but because she believed he would learn to be. That belief wrapped around him like a blanket he did not know he needed until now. Ethan climbed into his lap, resting his head against his father's chest. The boy's small heartbeat thumped softly against him, grounding him in a world suddenly wider than he had ever imagined. "Dad, are we going to be okay now?" Ethan murmured, voice barely above a whisper. The father closed his eyes, breathed deep, and allowed himself to accept the truth he had spent years refusing to believe. "Yeah, buddy. I think this is the start of something new." He tucked the documents, the compass, the key, the pendant, and the pages of his grandmother's journal into his pack as carefully as if they were living things. Before leaving, he paused at the cabin door and looked out toward the mountains. A heavy stillness settled over the valley, not threatening but expectant, as though the land itself was listening. The realization hit him like a slow, rising tide. Their journey wasn't over. It was deepening. The mountain held more answers. About his grandmother, about his mother, about himself, about the wounds carved across generations. And now, with his son beside him, he was ready to go back into the shadows beneath the earth. Not as a lost man searching for a miracle, but as a son following the last thread of love left for him. When dawn crept across the sky, pale and soft through the brittle curtains, he woke with purpose rather than dread for the first time in years. Today, they would follow the second map. Today, they would finish what she began. The morning arrived gently, pale light slipping through the brittle curtains and settling across the cabin floor in soft, hesitant streaks. The father woke before Ethan, lying still for a moment as the cold mountain air pressed around him like a quiet reminder of where they were and why they had come. Yesterday's discoveries flowed back into him. The compass, the key, the pendant, the journal, the hidden path marked on the map's back, each piece fitting together like the edges of a story he had spent years unknowingly walking toward. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't wake to dread or heaviness. He woke to purpose, sharp and real, enough to fill the hollow spaces inside him that hardship had carved out. He whispered a prayer into the silence, raw and grateful, thanking God not just for survival, but for direction, for renewal, for the soft turning of fate. Ethan slept curled under a worn quilt, his breathing even and peaceful, and the father let himself watch him for a moment, soaking in a sight he had rarely seen, a child finally resting without fear. When the boy stirred awake, blinking at the early light, the father smiled and answered before Ethan could even ask, "Yes, buddy, we're going back today." They packed quickly, layering against the cold, securing the compass, the key, the pendant, and the journal pages inside his jacket where they wouldn't be jostled. Before stepping outside, the father paused at the cabin door, pressing his palm against the aged wood as though it were the hand of someone guiding him forward. The air outside felt sharper, filled with a kind of expectant stillness that made the valley seem alive, awake, aware. They descended the slope carefully, retracing yesterday's path along the ridge, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots merging with the faint rustle of wind threading through birch and pine. The map guided them deeper into the forest, through thickets and over fallen logs, slick with dew, the trees seeming taller, the shadows longer, every sound magnified as though the mountain were slowly drawing its breath. When they reached the hidden dip in the earth that marked the entrance to the passage, the father lifted Ethan down and held his hand, feeling the faint pulse from the pendant inside his jacket, as if it sensed its destination. Together they stepped inside, leaving daylight behind in a soft, narrowing glow. The air grew cooler as they moved through the original passage, but this time the father didn't feel fear tugging at his ribs. The compass needle quivered, then pointed firmly toward a narrow fissure he hadn't explored the day before. A secret path, carefully disguised, marked only on the back of the second map. They followed the fissure, squeezing through the tight space until it opened into a sloping corridor etched with patterns of the same symbol found on the pendant and the tapestry. The walls hummed faintly beneath their palms, a low vibration that felt like the breathing of the earth itself. They walked in silence, listening to the echo of their footsteps and the faint, distant trickle of water somewhere far below. At a fork, the compass spun once, then stilled, pointing left with quiet certainty. The father followed it, trusting his grandmother's intentions more than he trusted the ground beneath him. After a long stretch of walking, the corridor widened abruptly into a cavern so vast and breathtaking that Ethan whispered in awe, "It looks like a church." And it did. Sunlight filtered down from cracks high above, painting the stone pillars in shimmering gold, while moss glowed softly in emerald patches along the walls. A circular platform sat in the center of the cavern, smooth and deliberate, not shaped by nature alone. In its heart rose a stone pedestal with a narrow indentation, perfectly matching the pendant. The father felt his pulse quicken, as if every step of his life, from childhood memories to nights in shelters to the brittle envelope under a chipped mug, had led him here. He looked at Ethan, who nodded with quiet trust, and removed the pendant, its metal warming instantly in his hand. When he placed it into the indentation, the platform shivered, a soft rumble echoing up through the soles of their boots. The pedestal sank an inch, stone grinding softly, and a hidden panel slid open at its base, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth, a long wooden box, a sealed envelope, and a folded parchment bearing his grandmother's familiar script. He unfolded the parchment first. "If you have come this far, you have already begun to heal. The rest you will understand when you are ready." His breath trembled as he opened the journal next. Page after page told the story his grandmother had never spoken aloud, her discovery of the tunnels, the lineage of guardianship, the treasures meant not for wealth but for restoration. She wrote of his mother, of mistakes and wounds she never found the courage to mend, of wanting desperately to protect him even as distance grew between them. She wrote of fearing that grief had broken their family beyond repair, and that one day he might wander the world feeling forgotten, unwanted, unseen. Her final plea struck him hardest: "Take what I could not finish, heal where I could not mend, protect what I nearly lost." Beneath the journal lay the long wooden box. With trembling fingers, he opened it to reveal documents carefully preserved, land agreements, mineral rights, geological surveys, and a deed transferring ownership of the entire mountain to him. His grandmother had safeguarded every inch of land they had walked, every stone, every root, every secret. Ethan stared in confusion. "Dad, what does that mean?" The father placed a shaking hand on his son's shoulder. "It means this place is ours now. It means we're its guardians." The last item was the sealed envelope with his name written softly across it. He opened it, breath unsteady, and read her final words. Words filled with love, regret, hope, and a belief in him he had never imagined she carried. She wrote that the treasure was never meant to make him rich, but to give him a place to rebuild a life with dignity, a foundation strong enough for Ethan to grow without the heaviness of fear. And the line that shattered him completely read, "You are worth more than what the world made you believe. If God led you here, it is because you were meant for restoration, not survival." Tears streamed freely now, hot and unstoppable. Ethan hugged him tightly, sensing the weight, even if he couldn't understand the words. The father held his son close, overwhelmed by gratitude, grief, and a profound sense of redemption that sank deep into the bones of his soul. After a long moment, he gathered the items with careful hands, storing them safely in his pack. Before leaving, he turned once more toward the vast chamber and whispered, "Thank you." The mountain answered with a faint breath of wind, gentle enough to feel like a blessing. They retraced their steps through the passages until daylight returned in a bright flood that warmed their skin. The valley looked different now, wider, brighter, filled with possibilities instead of fear. As they walked back toward the cabin, golden light spilled across the mountain like a quiet benediction, painting the ridges in warm hues of promise. When they reached the cabin door, the father paused, resting his hand on the wood, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. "We're home," he whispered, voice trembling with truth rather than hope. Ethan's face lit up, a smile blooming with a depth only a child who had known hardship could feel. "Home," he repeated softly, tasting the word like it was something new and precious. And for the first time in years, the father believed it. Not as a dream, not as a wish, but as reality. They stepped inside together, father and son, no longer lost, no longer wandering, ready to rebuild a life shaped not by scarcity or pain, but by grace, legacy, and the quiet, unwavering love of a grandmother who had never stopped believing in who they could become.